What's up guys, today we are reviewing the brand new Neonic Flare Prime X. This paddle has been pitched as a significantly cheaper alternative to the Paddletech ESQC, and in some ways I agree, and in others I don't. So let's dive right in. As a quick disclosure, Neonic did send this paddle to me for free, but no review was guaranteed, no video was paid for, they had no input on the video, and all thoughts are my own. I do have an affiliate link and discount code in the description if you choose to purchase a paddle, which does help support us to keep creating videos just like this. The Neonic Flare Prime X sells for $139.99, but with discount code PBStudio, you can save 10% on your order, which brings it down to about $126. So price-wise alone, this is already in an extremely competitive range, which is great for the consumer. But anyways, the rest of the specs for the Flare Prime X are as follows. It's a 14mm standard-shaped paddle, 5.5-inch handle length, 4-inch grip circumference, which is pretty small, thermoformed, and has a face layup of carbon fiber, fiberglass, and carbon fiber, which is the same layup as the Monarch all-court that I recently reviewed. The stats that are more specific to the unit that I received are swing weight of 106, twist weight of 6.64, RPM of 1869, balance of 23.7 centimeters, and static weight of 7.76 ounces. So all of those stats create a paddle that is very fast in the hand, as you would expect from most standard shape paddles on the market. This also gives you a lot of room to customize the paddle to your liking, which I would probably recommend doing a little bit because at a swing weight of 106, the ball does tend to push the paddle around a little bit. In this video, I'm first going to give you my thoughts on just the Neonic Flare Prime X, and then I will have a dedicated section to compare it to other paddles to give you an idea of how it stacks up, because I feel like that context is really important in deciding whether this paddle is worth it for you or not. The Flare Prime X feels pretty close to what I would expect given the specs that it has. It has that thermoformed, stiffer feel, and even more so because of that fiberglass layer. I will say it feels ever so slightly more plush than the Monarch all-court, but I would still place both of these on the stiffer spectrum of paddles. Similar to other thermoformed paddles, it also feels very dense, so every hit feels very solid, which is nice. As far as pop and power go, I think it excels in power more than it does pop, but both are still really good. On full swings like drives and overheads, the power feels very ample, and there were several times where people commented on the fact that the ball was coming quicker than they were used to from me, particularly given that I was using a standard-shaped paddle. The way I would describe it is enough pop and power for most amateurs to be dangerous with, but not so much that it's constantly getting you into trouble by popping the ball up. One thing I found myself constantly doing was just driving my thirds. It's probably some of the best drives I've had with a standard or wide body shaped paddle, and in fact, several people commented on the fact that my drives and putaways were better than average. Getting a hold of a shoulder-high ball felt like it was plenty of power to not be super concerned with the ball coming back. So, on shots where you can take a big swing, I do think it has a very healthy amount of power, especially for how light and low swing weight it is. One area I did find myself struggling more than I expected was on drops. I think it was the combination of being poppier and stiff that just made it feel like it was hard for me to place the drop how I wanted, especially when hitting it side by side with the ESQ 14.3mm, which feels softer and easier to shape the ball on certain shots. But we'll come back to that more later. Also, I think combining the fact that my unit has lower spin than what was probably intended just made it a little bit harder to shape the ball in certain ways, so I imagine that was contributing to my lack of confidence in the soft game with this paddle. It wasn't terrible, it was just enough that I felt kind of off when I was using it at certain times, but I'm sure I could adjust with just a little bit more time. I'm gonna go over my setup really quickly because I did make some adjustments to see how it would perform. First, I added a pink hexacore, and I'm not really going to go into why I added this. Honestly, really the only reason is just I like the texture on the grip, so I wouldn't stress about this or think about it too much. It's just something I like putting on my paddles. Then I added 3-inch strips of half-gram tape at all 4 corners of the paddle. This isn't a setup I use often, but I wanted to add some more plow-through, and then I wanted to balance it out by adding some weight on the bottom half of the paddle just to increase the stability a little bit more. This did solve my plow-through issue that I had initially and gave the paddle a good amount more finishing power. So doing something like this or adding weight at 3 and 9 with longer strips could be a setup to try if you want to have more plow-through. This setup increased the stats in the following ways. Static weight went from 7.76 ounces to 8.68. Swing weight went from 106 to 115. Twist weight went from 6.68 to 7.91. And the balance of the paddle did go down by adding that Hesa core to the handle. Okay, now the part that I think is the most important for this video, and that's the comparison. Because how you frame this paddle makes a big difference of what your expectation is for it. The two paddles that I'm primarily going to be comparing it to are the 11.624 Monarch All-Court 16mm and the PaddleTech ESQC 14.3mm. I know Neonic has made some comparisons to the PaddleTech 12.7mm, but I really think that paddle is kind of in an area of its own, especially for pop. So I'm not sure that it's as comparable as Neonic wanted it to be. I would have loved to compare the Flare Prime X to the Monarch All-Court 14mm because that probably makes more sense given that they're both 14mm, but I don't own one. With how much overlap there is between the Flare Prime X and the Monarch All-Court 16mm, I wouldn't be too surprised if both 14mm variants were very, very similar. I don't know that for a fact, I'm just making an educated guess. Anyways, these are how I would rank each of them after side-by-side testing. The first thing we are going to compare is the feel of the paddle, which is going to be one of the biggest distinctions you can draw with all of these paddles. With the ESQ 14.3mm, you are getting a more plush and cushioned feel, but it also feels more hollow and less solid around the face. The paddle gives a sensation of the ball dwelling on the face for a longer time as well. I think this can make it feel easier to manipulate the ball for the soft game because it feels like the ball doesn't want to get off the face as fast as the other two paddles. Now, on the opposite side of the spectrum, we have the 11.624 Monarch All-Court. This paddle is very stiff and makes a pingy noise when you hit the ball. The paddle doesn't give the sensation of the ball dwelling for very long because it feels so stiff. But at the net, it does feel a little bit more aggressive because of this. And then right between the two, we have the Neonic Flare Prime X. It isn't as cushioned feeling as the PaddleTech, and it's just a little bit less stiff than the All-Court, which is interesting because I would have expected the 14mm to be more stiff than the 16mm paddle. But with that being said, I think the Flare Prime X feels much closer to the Monarch All-Court than it does the PaddleTech. On screen for each of these categories, I'm going to have a little bar chart so that I can kind of plot out how far or close apart each of these paddles are for the given category. I'm hoping that this will help give you guys a gauge of how close or far apart I think these are. Both the All-Court and Flare Prime X feel dense and stiff, and this makes sense since they're both thermoformed and use the same face layout. If you were hoping that you could get a very similar feel to the PaddleTech at the price of this Neonic, I unfortunately have to say I don't think this is it. There's a very clear difference to me when hitting the ESQ and Flare Prime X for the feel off of the face. For power, out of the box, I would put the Flare Prime X and ESQ as a draw. If I had to pick one, I might give a very, very slight edge to the Flare Prime X, but I think it's mostly negligible. And I think some of that could come from stiffer feeling paddles generally give the perception to people that they are more poppy or powerful, and since the PaddleTech feels a little bit more cushioned, it may give the perception that it's not hitting as hard, but most people I hit with on court said that the ball was coming at about the same pace. Then below both of those, I would put the Monarch All-Court. It's not lacking behind so significantly, but just enough to be noticeable when hitting them all side by side. For lowest pop, I would put the Monarch All-Court, followed by basically a draw with the ESQ and Flare Prime X. And with that being said, I think the difference between the All-Court and ESQ is not all that significant. As far as sweet spot goes, in last place we have the ESQC. There are definitely certain resets on the court where it feels very obvious that the ESQC has a worse sweet spot. But I do think if you were to add weight, you could get it into a pretty manageable sweet spot. The 12.7mm from PaddleTech is the one that I think specifically has a much tighter sweet spot. As for the Neonic and All-Court, I'm going to call this a draw. There was no point with either of them where I felt like there was a significant difference in sweet spot size. Both are very playable with large sweet spots that you'd expect from this shape when thermoformed. And are you guys spotting a trend in these comparisons yet? Because a lot of these comparisons end in either a draw or very similar differences. Just keep that in mind. Now for control, this is pretty tricky because I feel like there are many factors that go into control. It's a combination of sweet spot size, amount of spin you can generate, and feel off the face, and how poppy they are. From easiest to control to hardest, I would pick the ESQ in first, I found that for anything related to the soft game, like drops, dinking, and resets, the slightly plusher feel gave me the perception that it was easier to control and move the ball in the way that I expected. Now, I do have to give it a small knock because of that smaller sweet spot, but if I had to pick one of these three paddles to confidently make a number of drops or dink in a row with, it's probably going to be the ESQ. And as mentioned before, I think some weight could help the sweet spot of the ESQ quite a bit and may limit how annoying that problem is. Then I would put the Monarch All Court in second and not far behind the Neonic Flare Prime X. Though these two are very close together and I wouldn't say there's a large difference separating them. The last thing I want to discuss is value. In first, we have the Flare Prime X, but in all reality, it might as well be a tie between the All Court and Flare Prime X because after discount codes, it's like $3 or $4 that separate these in price. And then in a clear last place, we have the ESQ because it's almost $100 more expensive than both of the other paddles. You could make an argument for the lifetime warranty and being made in the US, adding value to this paddle, but if we are strictly talking dollar amount, it's pretty clear who the winner is. Two final things I want to mention that may be important to you. One, I do think the handles on the Flare Prime X are a lot nicer than the ESQ. The ESQ has a much more bulky and blocky handle, so if you are a bit of a snob with handles, you're probably going to prefer how the Flare Prime X feels. It's also nice that you can kind of build the grip up the way you want, whereas with the PaddleTech, you're kind of just stuck with it being blocky and a little bit chunkier feeling. And then finally, I think this is a really important separator. It's that PaddleTech has consistently gotten very good spin. I think I have 15 variations of these newer raw carbon fiber PaddleTechs, and every single one of them has a very nice consistent texture on the face. These peel ply sheets being done in the US seem to have much higher degree of consistency than ones overseas. This was made clear to me when my Flare Prime X got an average amount of spin in the 1800s, but then my Flow Prime X, which is the same thing, just in a hybrid shape and 16mm, was doing over 2000. Presumably, these are made in the same factory with the same type of sheet, and that variance is just kind of annoying to see. So from experience of all these PaddleTechs consistently getting great spin and just knowing the consistency issues of these overseas paddles, it might be worth it to some of you to spend that extra $100 to basically guarantee that you're going to get more consistent spin on your paddle. So to wrap this up, I think the Flare Prime X is a very fun paddle. I think you get a nice bump in overall power compared to a Monarch All Court 16mm while being a little less stiff. Honestly, picking between the Flare Prime X and All Court is really confusing. I think it would be so easy for someone to hit the Flare Prime X and become a lot more excited because of recency bias. But honestly, both are very good paddles, and if you wanted the most amount of pop and power you could get in a standard shape paddle that is thermoformed without going to something as poppy as a ESQ 12.7mm, then the Flare Prime X is probably what you want. Now, some final notes on the comparison to the ESQ-C. While no, I don't think this is a true PaddleTech alternative. If you were hoping you could basically just get a PaddleTech at a cheaper price, that isn't what this is. I think in terms of overall performance, the Flare Prime X matches it very well. And one of the biggest benefits you're going to get with the Flare Prime X is that they have a larger sweet spot than the ESQ. But I still think the PaddleTechs have a very unique feel to them that make them very attractive, and the better grit consistency may be appealing to some of you. However, I would say for the vast majority of amateur players, do you really need to spend an extra $120, and will you really benefit from that extra performance? For most of you, no, probably not. I think the people who would want that the most are going to be the very consistent tournament goers. But the value of the Flare Prime X is so high that I think it would be easier to recommend this than the PaddleTech. I just want people to understand that when you buy this, you are not getting exactly a PaddleTech. And as long as you understand that, then yeah, have at it. It's a great paddle. I mentioned this on the most recent podcast, but I think we've really gotten to a point with some of these paddles where companies are more trying to target their paddles into a really small slot between other paddles. So if you're looking to buy one, don't expect a massive upgrade. Even as I was hitting all three of these side by side, I just found myself going, man, it's so hard to articulate this small difference. And is this small difference worth it to someone or not? Where I think it becomes an easier decision is if you don't own any of these yet, and this is your first time trying to pick any of them. But anyways, those are my thoughts on the new Flare Prime X. Hope you guys enjoyed the video, and I'll catch you in the next one.